They called me the family embarrassment, but on graduation day, when they whispered their cruel words in front of the crowd, I answered back in a way that made the entire world witness their shame. My mother's hiss of "You're embarrassing us" still echoed in my ears when the dean stepped to the microphone and announced my $2 million research award. The same family who had spent years crushing my dreams suddenly found themselves standing in the shadow of everything they'd tried to destroy. My name is Rachel Monroe, and at 28, I should have felt nothing but pride standing on the emerald lawn of Harrison University's main quad on that brilliant May afternoon. The sun painted everything in golden hues, the Gothic stone buildings, the sea of black graduation caps. The proud families clustered around their graduates like protective shields. But pride wasn't what twisted in my stomach as I smoothed down the navy blue dress I'd borrowed from my roommate Sarah, the fabric slightly too loose around my waist, the hem hitting awkwardly at my knees. The dress was the nicest thing I owned, which wasn't saying much. My black flats had worn spots on the heels from 4 years of walking everywhere because I couldn't afford a car. The plastic hair clip holding my brown hair in a simple bun had cost me $3 at the campus bookstore, a luxury I'd debated for 20 minutes before purchasing. Around me, other graduates posed in designer dresses and tailored suits, their parents beaming as professional photographers captured every angle. I'd just completed my doctoral program in biomedical engineering, 6 grueling years of research that had consumed every waking moment. While my classmates went to bars and football games, I'd been hunched over lab benches until the early morning hours, surviving on vending machine coffee and the kind of determination that comes from having nowhere else to go. My thesis on neural interface therapy had earned me recognition from professors who usually barely acknowledged graduate students existed. The graduation ceremony had ended 30 minutes ago at 2:30 in the afternoon, and now families swarmed the quad in celebration. Everywhere I looked, I saw scenes that might as well have been from a different planet, fathers lifting their daughters off the ground in bear hugs, mothers dabbing tears with lace handkerchiefs, siblings fighting over who got to pose with the graduate first. The air hummed with laughter, congratulations, and the click of cameras capturing moments that would live in family albums forever. I stood apart from it all, clutching my diploma in its leather folder against my chest like armor. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was surrounded by hundreds of people celebrating achievement, yet I felt more alone than I had during those countless nights in the empty lab. Part of me had hoped they wouldn't come at all. Part of me had prayed they would stay home in Connecticut, wrapped in their world of country club dinners and charity galas, too busy to acknowledge that their daughter, the one they'd written off as a lost cause, had actually accomplished something. But they were here. I could see them making their way across the lawn, and my chest tightened with each step they took in my direction. Even from a distance, they moved like royalty surveying their domain, completely out of place among the joyful chaos of proud families. They hadn't come to celebrate. They'd come to fulfill an obligation, to check a box that said they'd attended their daughter's graduation, probably so they could mention it casually at dinner parties without having to lie. A group of my fellow graduates burst into laughter nearby, champagne glasses clinking as someone's father proposed a toast. The sound felt like it was coming from underwater, muffled and distant. I watched a girl named Patricia, someone I barely knew but who'd always treated me with casual kindness, spin around in her cream silk dress while her entire extended family applauded. Her grandmother was crying happy tears, holding a bouquet of roses that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. That's when I felt that familiar knot of shame and longing that had followed me since childhood. The feeling that I was fundamentally different, fundamentally wrong, fundamentally not enough. Here I was, armed with a doctorate from a prestigious university and research that could change lives, and I still felt like the awkward teenager who'd been told she was disappointing at every family dinner. The late afternoon breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass and expensive perfume. Somewhere across the quad, a string quartet played classical music while families posed for professional portraits. It was the kind of perfect spring day that felt designed for celebration, for new beginnings, for hope. But as I watched my family approach, their faces already set in expressions I knew too well, I realized this wasn't going to be a new beginning at all. This was going to be the same old story, played out on a different stage. The only question was whether I'd finally learned how to change the ending. They approached like a perfectly choreographed performance, each step calculated to project success and superiority. My mother, Carolyn, led the procession in a crisp white Chanel suit that probably cost more than my entire year's stipend. Her signature red-soled Christian Louboutin heels clicked against the brick pathway with military precision, each strike announcing her presence to anyone within earshot. Her blonde hair was swept into an elegant chignon that hadn't moved despite the spring breeze, and her pearl necklace caught the afternoon light like tiny spotlights. Behind her, my father Richard checked his gold Rolex for the third time in as many minutes, his navy blazer bearing the subtle sheen of Italian wool. Everything about him screamed old money and established power, from his perfectly knotted silk tie to the way he carried himself like he owned every room he entered, which, given his position as managing partner at a prestigious law firm, he usually did. My brother Ethan brought up the rear, 26 years old and already everything my parents had dreamed of in a child. His Harvard law degree had earned him a corner office at a Manhattan firm before he'd even taken the bar exam. Today, he wore a charcoal gray blazer that fit him like it had been sewn directly onto his body, paired with leather shoes that gleamed despite walking across grass. His dark hair was styled in that effortlessly perfect way that actually required significant effort, and his smile was the kind that had charmed professors, judges, and society wives since he was 12. They stopped in front of me with the practiced coordination of people accustomed to making entrances. For a moment, we simply stared at each other across the invisible chasm that had defined our family for as long as I could remember. Other families around us embraced, laughed, took selfies. We stood frozen in a tableau of polite dysfunction. "Rachel," my mother said finally, her voice carrying that particular tone she reserved for acknowledging necessary unpleasantness. She didn't move to hug me, didn't reach for my hand, didn't even fully smile. Instead, she let her gaze travel slowly from my borrowed dress to my worn shoes, taking inventory of every way I fell short of her standards. "You made it," my father added with the enthusiasm one might reserve for commenting on the weather. He glanced around the quad, clearly calculating how quickly they could fulfill their obligation and leave. Ethan's approach was different, but no less cutting. He stepped forward with that easy confidence that had always made me feel like a child, even now that I was technically older than he'd been when he graduated law school. "Look at you, Dr. Monroe," he said with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Finally done with school. Must feel good to be finished with all this." The word "this" hung in the air like a slap. He gestured vaguely at the university, at my diploma, at the life I'd built here, dismissing 6 years of work with a single syllable. It was classic Ethan, packaging cruelty in the language of brotherly teasing. "At least now you're done with this silly science phase," he continued, loud enough that several nearby families turned to look. "Time to figure out what you're actually going to do with your life." "Right." My mother's lips pursed in what might have been an attempt at a smile. "We're proud, of course," she said, the words sounding like they'd been rehearsed. "Though I do wish you'd worn something more appropriate for the occasion." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt more violent than shouting. "You're embarrassing us." The words hit me like ice water. Here, surrounded by hundreds of celebrating families, in front of professors who respected my work and classmates who'd watched me earn this moment through sheer determination. My own mother had managed to make me feel ashamed of existing. A photographer approached our group, clearly assuming we were a happy family posing for graduation photos. "Would you like me to take a picture?" she asked brightly, camera already raised. "That's not necessary," my father said quickly, checking his watch again. "We have somewhere to be." I watched the photographer's face fall slightly as she moved on to the next family. one that actually wanted to commemorate this day. Around us, the celebration continued, parents wiping away tears of joy, graduates tossing their caps in the air, siblings racing across the lawn. But in our little bubble, the air felt thick and suffocating. "How long is this going to take?" Ethan asked, glancing at his phone. "I have dinner plans in the city." My mother nodded approvingly. "The Pemberton wedding reception. You remember the Pembertons. Don't you, Rachel, know? I suppose you wouldn't." She adjusted her purse strap with practiced efficiency. "Well, we should probably get going soon. Traffic back to Connecticut will be terrible." They hadn't been here for 10 minutes, and they were already planning their escape. I thought about all the nights I'd imagined this moment, how proud they'd be, how they'd finally see that I'd made something of myself despite their predictions. Instead, they stood there like tourists at a mildly interesting museum exhibit, checking their watches and making small talk while waiting for an acceptable amount of time to pass. "Your advisor seems nice," my mother said absently, though she'd never met Professor Williams and had no intention of doing so. "I'm sure he's very passionate about his work." The way she said passionate made it sound like a character flaw, something embarrassing that polite people didn't discuss in public. I could feel my hands shaking as I gripped my diploma tighter, my knuckles turning white against the dark leather. This was supposed to be my day. After everything I'd sacrificed, every night I'd chosen research over sleep, every social event I'd skipped to stay in the lab, every moment I'd doubted myself but pushed forward anyway. This was supposed to be the day that made it all worthwhile. Instead, I was standing in the shadow of my family's disappointment, feeling smaller and more invisible than ever. The announcement came over the sound system at exactly 3:15, Dean Harrison's voice cutting through the afternoon chatter like a bell. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention for a moment, we have a special presentation to make." I felt my stomach drop. Special presentations at graduation ceremonies usually meant honorary degrees for wealthy donors or recognition for retiring faculty. Whatever this was, it would only delay my family's inevitable escape and prolong this excruciating charade. "Oh, wonderful," my mother muttered under her breath, checking her diamond watch with visible irritation. "More ceremonies. Richard, we really should have left after the main event." My father nodded, his jaw tight with the particular brand of impatience that came from being somewhere he considered beneath his station. Around us, other families were gathering closer to the temporary stage, but my family remained rooted in place, radiating their desire to be anywhere else. Dean Harrison, a distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, stepped up to the microphone again. He'd been the one to hand me my diploma an hour earlier, offering a firm handshake and what I'd thought was genuine warmth in his congratulations. Now he stood before the crowd with a manila folder in his hands and something that looked almost like excitement in his expression. "In my 30 years as Dean of Graduate Studies," he began, his voice carrying across the quad, "I've had the privilege of watching countless brilliant minds pass through these halls. Today, I want to recognize one graduate whose work exemplifies the very best of what we hope to achieve in academic research work that will quite literally change lives." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Parents looked around, wondering whose child would be singled out for this unexpected honor. I watched my brother glance at his phone again, probably calculating whether he could still make his dinner reservation if they left in the next 10 minutes. "During her doctoral program," Dean Harrison continued, "this student has demonstrated not only exceptional academic achievement, but also the kind of innovative thinking that pushes the boundaries of what we thought possible. Her research into neural interface therapy has already caught the attention of medical institutions worldwide." My heart began to race. Neural interface therapy. Those words, my research, my life's work for the past 6 years hung in the air like a revelation. But surely he couldn't be talking about me. Students like me didn't get special recognition at graduation. Students like me got their diplomas, said thank you, and disappeared into obscurity. "What's neural interface therapy?" Ethan whispered to our mother, loud enough that several nearby families turned to look. "Some kind of computer thing, I imagine," she replied dismissively. "You know how these science types love their jargon." I wanted to tell them it wasn't jargon. I wanted to explain that neural interface therapy could help paralyzed patients regain motor function, that my research had developed new ways to bridge damaged neural pathways, that we were talking about giving hope to people who'd been told they'd never walk again, but my throat felt like it was closing, and the words stayed trapped inside me. Dean Harrison opened the folder in his hands, and I caught a glimpse of official letterhead, the kind that came from very important places with very large budgets. The National Institute of Health, in conjunction with the Whitmore Foundation for Medical Innovation, has awarded a research grant in the amount of $2 million to continue this groundbreaking work. The crowd stirred. $2 million was serious money, the kind of funding that launched careers and changed departments. Parents began looking around more intently, trying to identify which family would soon be celebrating this incredible honor. The recipient of this grant will be working with a team of leading researchers at Columbia University's Medical Center, with additional partnerships at Stanford and MIT. This represents not just recognition of exceptional work, but an investment in the future of rehabilitative medicine. My mother's posture straightened slightly. Despite herself, she was intrigued. Money had a way of getting her attention, even when it was connected to things she considered frivolous. My father had stopped checking his watch and was actually listening to the dean's words. "I want to call forward," Dean Harrison said, his voice rising with obvious pride. "Dr. Rachel Monroe?" The world tilted sideways. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't process that my name had just echoed across a quad filled with hundreds of people. Around me, applause began to build, starting as scattered claps and growing into something that sounded like thunder. "That's," Ethan started to say, his voice cracking slightly. "That's our daughter," my father whispered, and for the first time in my life, I heard something like awe in his voice. I looked at my mother, whose face had gone completely blank. Not disapproving, not dismissive, not calculating, just empty, as if her brain had suddenly stopped working. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed again, like a fish gasping for air. "Rachel," Dean Harrison called, shading his eyes against the sun as he searched the crowd. "Rachel Monroe." Somehow, my legs began to move. The sea of people parted as I walked toward the stage, and I could hear whispers following in my wake. $2 million. Columbia. Neural interface therapy. The words swirled around me like a dream, too big and too impossible to be real. But it was real. As I climbed the steps to the platform, Dean Harrison's smile was genuine and proud. "Your work will change lives," he said quietly, just loud enough for me to hear. "I hope you know how extraordinary this is." I turned to face the crowd, my diploma still clutched in one hand, and found my family in the sea of faces. They stood frozen exactly where I'd left them, 3 figures in expensive clothes surrounded by celebrating families, looking like they'd just watched their entire understanding of the world crumble and reform in the span of 30 seconds. For the first time in my life, they weren't looking at me with disappointment or dismissal or barely concealed shame. They were looking at me with something that might have been fear. Dean Harrison handed me a thick envelope bearing the official seals of the National Institute of Health and the Whitmore Foundation. The weight of it in my hands felt surreal, heavier than paper should be, dense with possibilities I'd never dared to imagine. The applause continued to roll across the quad in waves, punctuated by cheers and the rapid-fire clicking of cameras. "Dr. Monroe's research into neural interface therapy represents a quantum leap in our understanding of how to restore function to damaged nervous systems," Dean Harrison announced to the crowd, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades evaluating scientific merit. Her innovative approach to bridging neural pathways has already shown remarkable results in preliminary trials, offering hope to patients who were told they would never regain motor function. I stood there in my borrowed dress and worn shoes, holding $2 million in funding and trying to process that this was actually happening. The dean continued speaking, but his words seemed to come from very far away. Something about partnerships with leading medical institutions, about the potential to revolutionize rehabilitative medicine, about the kind of breakthrough that comes along once in a generation. From the stage, I could see my family with perfect clarity. They stood in the exact same spot where I'd left them, but everything about their posture had changed. My father's mouth hung slightly open, his usual mask of controlled authority completely gone. His expensive watch caught the sunlight as his hand trembled almost imperceptibly at his side. The man who'd built his reputation on never being caught off guard looked like he'd just been hit by lightning. My mother's transformation was even more dramatic. The woman who'd spent my entire life correcting my posture, criticizing my choices, and expressing disappointment in my very existence now stood perfectly still, her face drained of color. Her Chanel suit suddenly looked less like armor and more like a costume, as if she were playing dress-up in someone else's life. She clutched her pearl necklace with white knuckles, her carefully applied lipstick the only splash of color in her pale face. But it was Ethan's reaction that satisfied something dark and hungry in my chest. My golden boy brother, the one who'd sailed through Harvard Law on our parents' connections and his own effortless charm, looked like he'd just watched his world flip upside down. His perfectly styled hair couldn't hide the way his eyes darted between me and the dean, trying to recalibrate everything he thought he knew about his family's hierarchy. The phone he'd been checking obsessively hung forgotten in his hand. The selection committee was unanimous in their decision, Dean Harrison continued, and I realized he was speaking directly to me now, his voice warm with genuine pride. Dr. Monroe, your proposal didn't just demonstrate technical excellence, it showed the kind of vision and compassion that represents the very best of scientific inquiry. You're going to help people walk again. You're going to give parents their children back. You're going to change the world. The crowd erupted in another round of applause, but this time I barely heard it. Those words, "You're going to change the world," echoed in my mind like a mantra. How many times had I sat in that cramped lab at 2 a.m, questioning whether any of this mattered? How many times had I eaten ramen noodles for dinner while my family dined at country clubs, wondering if I was wasting my life on impossible dreams? A photographer from the university's communications department materialized beside the stage, her camera capturing every angle of this moment. I knew these photos would end up in alumni magazines, on the university website, in press releases announcing the grant. My face would be associated with words like breakthrough and innovation and groundbreaking research. Would you like to say a few words? Dean Harrison asked, stepping back from the microphone. I approached the podium on unsteady legs, looking out at hundreds of faces turned toward me in expectation. For 6 years, I'd presented my research to rooms full of professors and graduate students, defending my methods and explaining my hypotheses with confidence. But this felt different. This felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, about to jump into a future I'd never allowed myself to imagine. "Thank you," I began, my voice surprisingly steady despite the earthquake happening in my chest. This research isn't just about neural pathways or electrical impulses or complex algorithms. It's about a 10-year-old girl named Emma who was told she'd never walk again after a car accident. It's about a veteran named Marcus who lost the use of his legs serving our country. It's about every person who's been told that their limitations are permanent, that they need to accept a life smaller than the one they dreamed of. As I spoke, I could see my family more clearly than ever before. They weren't just listening to my words. They were hearing them, perhaps for the first time in my life. The dismissive expressions they'd worn like masks for so long had vanished, replaced by something that looked almost like recognition. For 6 years, I've worked on this project while people told me it was too ambitious, too complicated, too unlikely to succeed. I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. But I've learned that the most important breakthroughs happen when we refuse to accept that something is impossible, when we keep working even when no one believes in us, when we choose hope over resignation. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, talking about people who refused to give up on their dreams, while my own family had given up on me before I'd even started. But they weren't giving up on me now. They couldn't. The evidence was too overwhelming, the recognition too public, the achievement too undeniable. This grant will allow us to move from laboratory testing to human trials, I said, holding up the envelope that contained my future. Within 2 years, we hope to see our first patients regaining function they thought was lost forever, and within 5 years, we believe this technology will be standard treatment in rehabilitation centers across the country. The applause was deafening. People were standing now, and I could see phones recording my words, capturing this moment for posterity. Somewhere in that crowd were my professors, who'd guided this research from its earliest stages. Somewhere were my fellow graduate students, who'd celebrated small victories and commiserated over failed experiments. Somewhere were strangers who'd just learned that hope might be possible for conditions they'd accepted as hopeless. And somewhere, frozen in a tableau of shock and recalculation, was the family who'd called me an embarrassment just 30 minutes earlier. The world had just witnessed their daughter receive recognition they'd never dreamed possible, and there was no taking it back, no minimizing it, no explaining it away. This wasn't a participation trophy or a consolation prize. This was $2 million of validation from some of the most prestigious institutions in the country. For the first time in my life, they couldn't pretend I didn't matter. As I stepped down from the platform, the world had fundamentally changed. What had been polite graduation applause moments before had transformed into something electric, urgent. People who'd never looked at me twice were suddenly pushing forward, business cards appearing in hands like magic tricks. The quad, which had felt so vast and isolating just minutes earlier, now seemed to shrink around me as bodies pressed closer. Dr. Monroe. A woman in an elegant gray suit materialized at my elbow, her smile practiced but genuine. Dr. Sarah Whitfield from Columbia's Department of Biomedical Engineering. We've been following your work for months. We'd love to discuss collaboration opportunities. Before I could respond, a tall man with prematurely silver hair extended his hand. Professor James Mitchell, Stanford Medical Center. That presentation was extraordinary. We have facilities that could accelerate your human trials significantly. The business cards kept coming. MIT, Johns Hopkins, the Cleveland Clinic. Each one represented institutions I'd only dreamed of working with, places where the kind of research that had consumed my life was not just respected, but celebrated. I fumbled with the growing stack of cards, trying to process names and titles that blurred together in my overwhelmed mind. The applications for traumatic brain injury alone could be revolutionary, someone was saying. Have you considered the implications for stroke recovery? The Defense Department would be very interested in this technology for wounded veterans, added another voice. I found myself at the center of a crowd that grew larger by the moment. Graduate students from other departments pushed forward to congratulate me. Professors I'd only seen from afar in lecture halls were treating me like a colleague, an equal. The transformation was so complete, so sudden, that I felt like I was watching it happen to someone else. Through the crowd, I caught glimpses of my family. They remained frozen in their original spot, but now they looked less like dignified observers and more like castaways watching a ship sail away without them. The space around them had emptied as people gravitated toward the center of attention toward me. For the first time in our family's history, I was the one people wanted to talk to. Dr. Monroe, a young journalist with a digital recorder thrust toward me, appeared at my side. Could you comment on what this grant means for the future of neural rehabilitation? Our readers would love to hear about the human impact of your research. The human impact. 6 years ago, when I'd first proposed this research, My advisor had warned me that it was too ambitious for a doctoral project. 3 years ago, when initial trials had failed spectacularly, I'd spent an entire night in the lab wondering if I was chasing an impossible dream. 1 year ago, when my family had suggested I consider other options for my career, I'd almost believed them. Now reporters wanted to interview me about changing the world. The technology itself is just the beginning, I heard myself saying, my voice steadier than I felt. What we're really talking about is hope. We're talking about telling a mother that her child might walk again. We're talking about giving a soldier back the life he thought he'd lost. We're talking about refusing to accept limitations that previous generations considered permanent. As I spoke, I noticed my family beginning to move. Not toward me, they couldn't penetrate the crowd even if they tried, but positioning themselves where they could be seen, where people might notice their connection to the suddenly famous Dr. Rachel Monroe. My mother had straightened her shoulders and arranged her face into what she probably thought was a proud maternal expression. My father was checking his phone, no doubt researching the institutions whose representatives were clamoring for my attention. Ethan's transformation was the most pronounced. The dismissive posture had vanished, replaced by something that looked almost like calculation. I watched him smooth his hair and adjust his blazer, preparing himself for what he probably already saw as opportunities. If his sister was suddenly important, suddenly valuable, then proximity to her meant proximity to power. Dr. Monroe. Another voice cut through the crowd. We'd like to schedule a meeting to discuss lab space and equipment. When would be convenient for you? When would be convenient for me? The phrase hit me like a physical force. For 28 years, my life had been arranged around other people's convenience. I'd shaped my schedule around my family's expectations, my dreams around their approval, my sense of self around their assessment of my worth. Now, strangers were asking when things would be convenient for me, as if my time had value, as if my preferences mattered. I'll need to review all the partnership proposals carefully, I said, surprised by how natural the word sounded. My research team and I will be making decisions based on which institutions can best support the next phase of trials. My research team. I had a research team now. I had decisions to make, partnerships to evaluate, a future to plan that belonged entirely to me. The weight of the grant envelope in my hands felt like potential energy, like standing at the top of a mountain I'd been climbing my entire life. Through the crowd, I caught sight of Professor Williams, my doctoral advisor, beaming with pride as he spoke to a cluster of colleagues. He'd been the one person who'd believed in this research from the beginning, who'd helped me refine my hypotheses when everyone else said they were too broad, who'd stayed late in the lab helping me troubleshoot equipment when experiments failed. Seeing his joy felt like validation of something deeper than professional success. It felt like proof that I'd been right to trust my instincts, even when doing so meant disappointing everyone else I cared about. There's going to be significant media interest in this story, the journalist was saying. Breakthrough medical research, young female scientist, life-changing technology. This has all the elements of a compelling narrative. A compelling narrative. My life, which had felt so small and insignificant just hours earlier, was suddenly newsworthy. The quiet determination that had carried me through years of 12-hour days and failed experiments was now being reframed as inspiration, as an example of what was possible when brilliant minds were given the resources they needed to flourish. I looked across the crowd toward my family one more time. They stood at the edge of the celebration like ghosts at a feast, close enough to witness everything but too far away to participate. The same distance they'd maintained my entire life, except now it was working against them instead of me. For the first time in my life, I was exactly where I belonged, surrounded by people who valued what I had to offer, holding proof that my dreams weren't silly or unrealistic or embarrassing. They were worth $2 million. The crowd around me had finally begun to thin by 4:30 in the afternoon. Business cards exchanged and preliminary meetings scheduled for the coming weeks. As the last of the Columbia representatives shook my hand and promised to send detailed partnership proposals by Monday, I found myself facing the inevitable my family had been waiting, hovering at the edges of my triumph like vultures circling something they hadn't quite decided was dead yet. They approached with a coordination that would have been impressive if it weren't so transparent. Gone was the casual dismissal from earlier. My mother's stride had purpose now, her Chanel suit armor for a battle she was already planning. My father's expression had shifted from bored obligation to something that looked almost like respect, though I could see the calculations running behind his eyes. Ethan brought up the rear, his earlier smugness replaced by something hungrier, more desperate. "Rachel," my mother called out, her voice pitched at exactly the right volume to suggest maternal pride to anyone still within earshot. "Sweetheart, we're so proud of you." Sweetheart. She hadn't called me sweetheart since I was 12 years old and still malleable enough to mold into her vision of acceptable femininity. The endearment felt foreign in her mouth, like she was speaking a language she'd forgotten how to pronounce. $2 million, my father said, shaking his head in what I supposed was meant to be amazement. That's substantial funding. Rachel, very impressive." He paused, and I could see him mentally shifting gears, moving from dismissal to opportunity assessment. "We should celebrate. The country club has an excellent wine selection, and we could discuss how to leverage this opportunity properly." Leverage. Of course, that would be his first instinct, not celebration, not pride, but strategy. How to turn my achievement into something that served their purposes, their network, their social standing. Ethan stepped forward with that $1 million smile that had charmed professors and judges throughout his academic career. "I have to admit, I'm impressed," he said, and the admission sounded like it physically hurt him. "This is bigger than I expected. Much bigger." He glanced around the quad, taking in the lingering clusters of people still discussing my research. "The legal implications alone must be fascinating. Patent law, intellectual property rights, licensing agreements, there's probably a fortune to be made in the commercial applications." There it was, in less than 30 seconds. They'd managed to reframe my life's work as a business opportunity, a networking event, a legal puzzle to be solved. The research that could help paralyzed patients walk again had been reduced to leverage points and profit margins. "Let's get dinner," my mother continued, her voice taking on that bright, artificial quality she used at charity fundraisers. "We have so much to catch up on. And honestly, darling, we should probably discuss media strategy. This kind of attention can be wonderful, but it needs to be managed properly. You'll want to be careful about which publications you speak with, which institutions you align yourself with." Media strategy. As if the interviews I'd given 20 minutes earlier had been fumbling amateur attempts that required their sophisticated intervention. As if I hadn't just spent 6 years learning to articulate complex scientific concepts to audiences ranging from undergraduates to international conferences. "The Times would be interested in this story," my father added, already pulling out his phone. "I know people there. Good people. They could ensure the coverage frames you properly emphasizes the prestige of the institutions involved, the significance of the funding amount, the potential applications." He looked up from his phone with the kind of smile he usually reserved for clients who'd just agreed to pay his premium rates. "We could position this as a family success story, the kind of background and support system that produces this caliber of achievement." Family success story. I stared at him, wondering if he'd actually forgotten the last 28 years of my life, or if he was simply hoping I had. The same family that had refused to help with tuition, that had missed every academic award ceremony, that had suggested I consider more practical career options at every holiday dinner. Now they wanted to claim credit for my achievement. "Shh, Ethan said, warming to the theme. "This could be great for all of us. I mean, having a sister who's doing groundbreaking medical research. That's the kind of thing that opens doors in my field, too. Clients love working with firms that have interesting connections, compelling stories." My research had become a compelling story for his law practice. My breakthrough in neural interface therapy was now a networking tool for his corporate clients. The work that had consumed my life, that had driven me to sleep in lab chairs and survive on vending machine dinners, was being repackaged as a family achievement that would benefit everyone except the person who'd actually done it. "We should probably head out soon," my mother said, glancing at her watch with practiced efficiency. "Traffic back to Greenwich will be horrible if we wait much longer, and we have the Pemberton reception at 7:30. Rachel, you should come with us. It would be perfect timing to share your news with the right people." The right people? As if the representatives from MIT and Stanford and Columbia who'd just handed me their business cards weren't the right people. As if the journalists who'd asked about the human impact of my research weren't worth talking to. The right people, in my mother's world, were the ones who attended charity galas and country club dinners, who measured success in social connections rather than scientific breakthroughs. "You'll want to network strategically," my father added, his tone taking on the authoritative quality he used in board meetings. "This kind of recognition can be a springboard to much bigger opportunities, but only if it's handled correctly. We know people who could help venture capitalists, pharmaceutical executives, government liaisons, the kind of connections that turn academic research into real-world impact." Real-world impact, as if helping paralyzed patients regain mobility wasn't real-world impact, as if 6 years of meticulous research wasn't already changing lives. They were speaking about my work like it was a rough draft, a promising start that required their sophisticated polish to become truly meaningful. I looked at the three of them standing there in their expensive clothes, their faces bright with newfound interest in my existence, and felt something cold settle in my chest. This wasn't pride. This wasn't celebration. This wasn't even genuine surprise at my achievement. This was annexation. They were moving to claim territory they'd abandoned years ago, planting their flag on success they'd done nothing to cultivate. The same family that had called my dreams silly, my research a phase, my very presence embarrassing now, they wanted to be part of the story when the story had suddenly become worth telling. "So," my mother said, her smile wide and expectant, "shall we go celebrate properly? I know you must be exhausted, but this is too important not to mark appropriately. The club is expecting us, and everyone is just dying to hear about your wonderful news." Everyone was dying to hear about my wonderful news, not because they cared about neural interface therapy or the patients it could help, but because it reflected well on the Monroe family name, because it was the kind of achievement that enhanced their social currency at dinner parties and charity auctions. For the first time in my life, I had something they wanted. For the first time in my life, I held all the cards. And for the first time in my life, I had the power to say no. The word came out of my mouth before I'd even realized I was going to say it. "No." The single syllable hung in the air between us like a physical barrier. My family's faces went through identical transformations: confusion, then disbelief, then something that looked almost like panic. They weren't used to hearing that word from me. For 28 years, I'd been the accommodating one, the one who rearranged her schedule around their convenience, who swallowed disappointment with a smile, who made herself smaller so they could feel bigger. "I'm sorry," my mother said, her voice pitched higher than usual, as if she hadn't heard correctly. "I said no." I stood straighter, feeling the weight of the grant envelope in my hands like armor. "I'm not going to the country club. I'm not going to the Pemberton reception. I'm not going to be your networking opportunity or your compelling family story." The quad around us had mostly emptied, just a few lingering clusters of families taking final photos. But something in my voice, or perhaps the sudden tension radiating from our group, had caught the attention of several nearby graduates. I could feel eyes turning toward us, people beginning to tune in to what was clearly becoming more than a casual family conversation. "Rachel," my father said, his voice taking on the careful tone he used when negotiating with difficult clients. "You're obviously emotional right now. This is a big day, a lot of excitement. Why don't we just—" "Emotional." I cut him off, and I was surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "You think I'm being emotional?" I looked at each of them in turn, my mother with her perfect hair and calculating eyes, my father with his expensive watch and practiced authority, my brother with his Harvard confidence and easy smile. They stood there in their designer clothes, waiting for me to fall back into the familiar pattern of compliance and gratitude. But something had shifted. The girl who had apologized for existing, who had tried to earn their approval through academic achievement, who had believed their assessment of her worth, that girl had died somewhere between Dean Harrison's announcement and this moment. "Where were you?" I began, my voice low but carrying clearly across the space between us. "When I was working 3 jobs to pay for graduate school." My mother's mouth opened, but no sound came out. "Why, where were you when I won the Harrison Research Fellowship 2 years ago, when I published my first paper in the Journal of Neural Engineering, when I presented at the International Conference on Biomedical Innovation in front of 800 researchers?" I took a step closer, and something in my posture made all 3 of them take an involuntary step back. "Where were you when I spent Christmas break in the lab because I couldn't afford to fly home? When I lived on ramen noodles and peanut butter sandwiches for 6 months because I had to choose between eating and buying research materials? When I called you, crying, because Professor Davidson told me my research was too ambitious and maybe I should consider a different thesis topic?" The words were coming faster now, years of suppressed hurt pouring out like water through a broken dam. Around us, the eavesdropping had become more obvious. Other families had slowed their conversations. Phones had come out, and I realized that whatever happened next would likely be witnessed by dozens of people. I didn't care. "You called my dreams worthless," I continued, my voice rising just enough to carry. "You said my research was a silly science phase. You told me I was embarrassing the family. And now that the world is calling my work priceless, suddenly you want to celebrate." My mother finally found her voice. "We've always supported you," she said, but the words sounded hollow even to her. "We came to your graduation, didn't we? We're here." "You came because it was socially expected," I shot back. "You came because not showing up would have reflected badly on you. You didn't come for me. You came for appearances." Ethan stepped forward, his lawyer instincts kicking in. "Look, we're family. Families support each other. That's what we do. Maybe we didn't always understand your work, but—" "Support each other," I laughed, and the sound was sharp enough to make him flinch. "When did you ever support me, Ethan? When you got your law degree funded entirely by Mom and Dad while I took out $60,000 in loans? When you moved into that Manhattan apartment they co-signed for while I shared a basement studio with 2 roommates? When you landed that job through Dad's connections while I applied to 300 positions and got rejected from all of them?" His face flushed red above his expensive blazer. "That's different. The circumstances were—" "The circumstances were that you were the golden child and I was the disappointment," I said flatly. "Until about 30 minutes ago, when I suddenly became valuable." A small crowd had definitely gathered now. I could see phones recording, hear whispered conversations about what was happening. Part of me, the part that had been trained since childhood to avoid scenes, to keep family business private, to never embarrass the Monroe name, wanted to stop, to lower my voice, to handle this with the discretion my upbringing demanded. But the rest of me, the part that had just been handed $2 million and validation from the most prestigious institutions in the country, couldn't bring myself to care about their comfort anymore. "Shh, you know what the really tragic part is," I continued, my voice carrying across the quad like a closing argument. "I would have forgiven all of it, the emotional neglect, the financial abandonment, the constant criticism. I would have welcomed you back with open arms if you'd just shown up today with genuine pride, with real joy for my achievement." My mother's composure was cracking, her carefully applied makeup unable to hide the tightness around her eyes. "We are proud, Rachel. Of course we're proud." "No," I said simply. "You're not proud. You're calculating. You're already figuring out how to leverage my success for your benefit. You're treating my life's work like a business opportunity that just landed in your lap." My father cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the public nature of this conversation. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately." "Privately?" I asked. "Like how you privately told your friends I was wasting my potential on impractical research, Like how you privately suggested I consider teaching high school science instead of pursuing my doctorate. Like how you privately made it clear that my presence at family gatherings was tolerated rather than welcomed. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the conversations around us had stopped, leaving only the sound of wind through the trees and the distant hum of traffic. My family stood there like defendants awaiting a verdict, their expensive clothes and practiced confidence suddenly looking like costumes that no longer fit. "This is my moment," I said finally, my voice quiet but unwavering. "My achievement. My future. And you're not part of it." The words fell between us like a gavel, final and irrevocable. For the first time in my life, I had drawn a line in the sand, and they were standing on the wrong side of it. The silence stretched between us like a chasm, filled with 28 years of disappointment, dismissal, and missed opportunities. My family stood there in their designer armor, looking smaller somehow despite their expensive clothes and practiced authority. The crowd around us had grown larger, phones held discreetly at angles that suggested this confrontation would be replaying on social media within the hour. My mother was the first to try salvaging the situation. "Rachel, please," she said, her voice taking on the wheedling tone she used when reality refused to conform to her expectations. "You're upset, and I understand that, but we're still family. We can work through this." "Can we?" I asked, genuinely curious, because I've been trying to work through this my entire life. I've been hoping that someday you'd see me as more than a disappointment, more than an embarrassment, more than a problem to be managed. I shifted the grant envelope to my other hand, feeling its weight like a talisman. Around us, the late afternoon sun painted everything in golden light, the Gothic buildings, the scattered graduates, the faces of strangers who had somehow become witnesses to the most important moment of my life. "But here's what I've learned today," I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. "I don't need you to see me. The world already sees me. The National Institute of Health sees me. Columbia sees me. Stanford sees me. MIT sees me. They see my work, my potential, my value, and they're investing $2 million in that vision." My father took a step forward, his face flushed with the kind of anger he usually reserved for opposing counsel. "You're making a mistake, Rachel. Family is everything. Connections matter in this world. You think those institutions will care about you personally. You think they'll be there when things get difficult." "They'll be there because they believe in what I can accomplish," I replied. "Not because they're obligated by blood, not because it serves their social standing, but because they recognize excellence when they see it. That's a kind of relationship you've never offered me." Ethan made one last attempt, his lawyer instincts recognizing a losing case but unable to stop arguing. "Look, maybe we haven't been perfect, but we're here now. Doesn't that count for something? We want to be part of your success." "You want to be part of my success," I repeated slowly, tasting the words. "Not part of my life, not part of my struggles, not part of my journey, just the profitable ending." I looked at each of them one final time, memorizing their faces in this moment of reckoning. My mother, whose pursuit of social perfection had left no room for a daughter who refused to fit the mold. My father, whose definition of success was so narrow it couldn't accommodate achievement that didn't come with the right pedigree. My brother, whose easy confidence had never been tested by genuine adversity. "I used to dream about this moment," I said quietly. "Not the grant, not the recognition, but the moment when you'd finally be proud of me, when you'd realize that the daughter you dismissed had become someone worth knowing." The crowd around us was completely silent now, everyone straining to hear what came next. "But I don't need that anymore," I continued. "I don't need your pride, your approval, or your validation. I have something better. I have my own." I turned away from them, facing the university that had become my real home, the professors who had believed in me, the future that stretched ahead, bright with possibility. Behind me, I heard my mother call my name, heard my father's voice taking on the commanding tone he used when he expected immediate compliance. But I was already walking away. "Rachel," Ethan shouted, desperation creeping into his voice. "You can't just leave, we're your family." I stopped and turned back one final time. "No," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the quad. "You're the people who share my DNA. My family is the community I've built here, the colleagues who respect my work, the patients who will benefit from my research. My family is everyone who believed in me when you couldn't." I started walking again, my steps steady and sure. The crowd parted to let me through, and I could hear whispered conversations as I passed. "Did you see that she just walked away from them? $2 million grant, and they treated her like that. Good for her. Sometimes you have to choose your own family." As I reached the edge of the quad, Professor Williams appeared at my side, his face beaming with pride and something that might have been protective anger. "Rachel," he said quietly, "that was remarkable. Both the grant and, well, everything else." I smiled at him, feeling lighter than I had in years. "It was a long time coming." "Where will you go now?" he asked. I looked back once more at the scene behind me, my family still standing frozen in their expensive clothes, surrounded by strangers who had witnessed their public humiliation. They looked exactly as small and petty as they'd always made me feel, but the difference was that their opinion no longer mattered. "Forward," I said simply. "I'm going forward." The setting sun painted the campus in shades of gold and possibility as I walked toward my car, the grant envelope clutched in my hand and my real life finally beginning. For the first time in 28 years, I was free to become exactly who I was meant to be, without their approval, without their permission, and without their limitations. The girl who had been embarrassed by her own existence was gone. In her place stood Dr. Rachel Monroe, researcher, innovator, and the architect of her own extraordinary future. Thank you for listening to this story of resilience and revenge. I'd love to hear where you're listening from and what this story means to you. Please leave a comment below, sharing your thoughts and your location so we can connect with listeners from around the world. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share your own experiences of overcoming family expectations or finding success on your own terms.